In 1970, a truck driver named Hank Price went missing. For 40 years, his family was told he'd crashed into a river, a tragic closed case. But when his abandoned truck was found inside a forgotten sealed tunnel, his daughter Evelyn knew the official story was a lie. She started digging and uncovered a 40-year-old secret, a conspiracy so dark powerful people would do anything to keep it buried forever. They said a landslide sealed that tunnel by accident, trapping Hank's truck inside. But the evidence she finds suggests something far more sinister. They told her he vanished. But what if he was silenced? Subscribe now, so you won't miss similar chilling stories on our channel in the future. And tell us where you're watching from, and what time it is there. We love seeing where our audience tunes in from. The manila envelope arrived on a Tuesday, unmarked except for a smudged postmark from a town she didn't recognize. Evelyn Price, a woman who'd spent her life organizing school records and church bake sales, looked at it with mild curiosity. It was probably a donation request or a misdirected bill. But when she tore it open, something heavy slid out and clattered onto her kitchen table. It wasn't a letter, it was a key. A single, old-fashioned brass key, the kind used for truck ignitions back when things were built to last. It was worn smooth in some places and green with age in others. But what made her breath catch in her throat were the etchings scratched crudely into the metal. A date, 7/14/70, and below it, a route number. A route her father was never supposed to have taken. For 40 years, Evelyn had lived with the story they'd all been given. Her father, Hank Price, a reliable long-haul trucker with a dry wit and a love for diner coffee, had disappeared in the summer of 1970. The official report said his rig had lost control on a rain-slicked mountain pass, plunging into the deep, fast-moving currents of the Calico River. They never found the truck. They never found him. The insurance company settled, the town grieved, and a small, quiet stone was placed in the local cemetery bearing his name. A memorial, they called it, not a grave. A story, neat and tidy. But it had left a hole in her life so vast it had swallowed her childhood. Now this key sat on her polished oak table, a solid, tangible lie. She picked it up. It was heavy, real. The metal was cold at first, then warm to her touch, as if a ghost had just passed it to her. Her father's hands had held this. She was certain of it. The route number etched into the brass wasn't the one he was assigned that day. She knew his routes by heart. As a child, she'd traced them on maps while he was away, imagining every turn and stop. This route led to the old Black Ridge Pass, a road that had been abandoned for decades. It went nowhere near the Calico River. A hot, angry energy surged through her, a feeling she hadn't felt in years. It was the frantic, desperate hope of a child who still believed her father might walk through the door, mixed with the cold fury of a woman who suddenly realized she'd been fed a convenient lie. For 40 years, her grief had been a quiet, accepted part of her. Now, it was a roaring fire. Who sent this? Why now? The questions were a storm in her mind, but one thought rose above the rest. She had to do something. She couldn't just sit with this. The weight of the key was the weight of an untold story, and it was too heavy to carry alone. Her first mistake was believing the truth was enough. Fueled by a raw, unfiltered surge of adrenaline and 40 years of suppressed questions, she decided to go to the county supervisor's public forum that very evening. She didn't call a lawyer. She didn't confide in her daughter Miri, not yet. This felt too personal, too explosive. She thought if she just presented this impossible object, this key that shouldn't exist, they would have to listen. They would have to reopen the case. You could almost hear yourself yelling at her, "Don't, Evelyn, don't show them your only card." But grief and hope make people reckless. She walked into the sterile, wood-paneled meeting room, clutching the key in her pocket like a holy relic. The air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and bureaucratic indifference. When her turn came to speak at the public microphone, her voice trembled, but she stood tall. She introduced herself as the daughter of Hank Price, a name that drew a few faint murmurs of recognition from the older people in the crowd. She held up the key. "This was my father's," she said, her voice growing stronger. "It was mailed to me today. It's etched with the date he disappeared and a route number for Black Ridge Pass. The official story is that he crashed into the Calico River, miles away from there. This key proves that story is wrong. I'm asking the county to help me find out what really happened." A hush fell over the room. For a brief, shining moment, Evelyn felt a surge of triumph. She had done it. She had broken the 40-year silence. But then County Supervisor Clay Dobson leaned into his microphone. He was a handsome man in a tailored suit, with a practiced smile that never quite reached his eyes. He gave her a look of profound, patronizing pity. "Mrs. Price," he said, his voice oozing a false sympathy that made her skin crawl. "We all remember your father, a good man, and we all understand that grief can linger. It can make us see patterns where there are none." He gently steepled his fingers, and she saw him rub his gold wedding band with his thumb, a small, dismissive gesture. "An old key from a junk shop? A prank from some cruel kids? There are 100 logical explanations. The county spent thousands of man-hours investigating your father's accident. The case is closed. To reopen it based on this," he gestured vaguely at the key, "would be an irresponsible use of taxpayer money." He wasn't just dismissing her, he was painting her as a hysterical, grieving woman clinging to fantasy. Her face burned with shame. Whispers rippled through the audience. She could feel their eyes on her, some with pity, some with scorn. Her moment of hope had curdled into public humiliation. "But the route number," she started, her voice now desperate. Dobson cut her off, his voice firm but still draped in that sickeningly gentle tone. "We have your father's official dispatch logs. They are a matter of public record. He was routed nowhere near Black Ridge. I'm sorry for your continued pain, Mrs. Price, truly. But this forum is for county business, not for relitigating settled tragedies." It was over. He had used his power, his smooth words, and the weight of officialdom to crush her. She retreated from the microphone, her legs feeling like lead, the key now feeling like a heavy, useless lump of metal in her pocket. As she stumbled out of the hall and into the cool night air, she pulled out her phone and sent a quick text to her daughter. "Headed to the cemetery. I'm okay." It was a habit Miri had insisted on, a safety check-in whenever she went somewhere alone at night, a small beacon of care in a world that had just shown her how cold and dismissive it could be. She drove to the quiet, manicured grounds where the stone with her father's name stood. There was no body beneath it, just 40 years of questions. The moonlight cast long shadows from the tombstones. She knelt on the damp grass, the humiliation from the meeting still hot on her cheeks. They thought she was crazy. They wanted her to go away, to be a good, quiet daughter, and let the past lie buried. But holding that key had changed something inside her. It was a promise of a truth yet to be found. She placed her hand on the cold granite, the engraved letters of Hank Price familiar under her fingertips. All the frustration, the shame, and the 40 years of aching loss coalesced into a single, unbreakable vow. Her daughter Miri was pregnant with her first child, a new life coming into their family, a future her father would never see. "I will find you, Dad," she whispered into the silent darkness, her voice thick with emotion and steel. "I swear it. Before my first grandchild is born, I will find out what they did to you." She felt a profound sense of purpose settle over her, a calm clarity in the midst of the storm. She wasn't just a grieving daughter anymore, she was a woman with a mission. As she stood up to leave, her resolve hardening like iron, she noticed something at the far edge of the cemetery, by the old iron gate. A dark sedan, parked with its lights off. It was too late for visitors. A chill that had nothing to do with the night air snaked down her spine. Were they watching her? Or was it just her imagination, inflamed by Dobson's condescending performance? She quickly got into her car, locked the doors, and drove away, her eyes fixed on the rearview mirror. The car didn't follow, but the feeling of being watched, of having kicked a hornet's nest she didn't understand, lingered long after the cemetery disappeared behind her. The morning after her public humiliation, Evelyn woke to a house that felt too quiet, the silence echoing her own defeat. The brass key sat on her nightstand, mocking her. What had she been thinking, storming into that meeting like a charging bull? Dobson had swatted her away like a fly, and now she was not only grieving but looked like a fool. The doorbell rang, and she found her daughter Miri on the doorstep, holding 2 steaming cups of coffee and a cardboard box full of folders. Miri didn't say, "I told you so." She didn't have to. Her warm, steady presence was a balm on Evelyn's bruised spirit. Miri, with her neat planner and her habit of sketching old buildings in a notebook, was the calm to Evelyn's storm. She was a planner, a researcher, her time as an emergency management clerk having drilled into her the importance of protocols and evidence. She placed the coffee on the table and looked her mother in the eye. "Okay," Miri said, her voice gentle but firm. "You tried the front door, it's locked. Now we find the back window." That simple statement reignited the flame inside Evelyn. She wasn't alone in this. Hope, warm and bright, began to push back against the despair. Miri was with her, and Miri believed her. Together, they sat at the kitchen table, the very same table where Hank used to tell them stories of the road. Miri opened the box. Inside were old, brittle Department of Transportation maps she had carefully borrowed from the Historical Society archives. They smelled of dust and forgotten time. For hours, they hunched over the fragile paper, tracing the faded red lines of old highways with their fingers. It was Miri who found it first. Her finger stopped on a thin, dotted line snaking through the desolate terrain of Black Ridge Pass. The label was almost illegible, printed in tiny, faded type, Black Ridge Service Tunnel. It wasn't a public road, it was a maintenance access tunnel, built in the 50s. "Dad never mentioned a tunnel," Evelyn murmured, leaning in closer. Miri was already pulling out a county planning file from her box. "According to this, there was a major landslide on the pass in the summer of 1970, she said, her voice quiet with discovery. "The report says the state sealed both ends of the service tunnel as a safety precaution, said it was structurally unstable. July 1970. The timing was too perfect to be a coincidence." A surge of triumphant energy shot through Evelyn. This was it. A forgotten tunnel, sealed right when her father disappeared on a route he was never supposed to be on. It was a tangible place, a real location to focus their search. They weren't just chasing a ghost anymore, they were chasing a landmark. Getting permission to see the closure records for the tunnel was their next step. Evelyn knew another public confrontation would be a disaster. This time she would play their game. She made the call to the county clerk's office, forcing a polite, almost apologetic tone into her voice. She explained she was doing some family history research, just a personal project to honor her father's memory. It was a small lie that tasted like ash in her mouth, but it worked. The clerk, a tired-sounding woman named Doris, granted them a 1-hour appointment in the county records archive that Friday. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. It was proof that a quiet, methodical approach could succeed where a loud, emotional one had failed. When they arrived at the county building, the air was heavy with the silence of bureaucracy. The archive was in the basement, a windowless room with rows of towering metal shelves groaning under the weight of decaying cardboard boxes. The air was cool and dry, thick with the scent of aging paper. Doris pointed them to a section marked Public Works, 1965, 1975, checked her watch, and told them she'd be back in an hour. The door swung shut behind her with a soft whoosh. They set to work, Miri's organized approach a stark contrast to Evelyn's anxious energy. Miri carefully documented every box they opened, while Evelyn pulled out dusty, string-bound ledgers, her heart pounding with every turn of a page. They were about 40 minutes in, deep in the silent world of forgotten paperwork, when they heard it. A heavy metallic thud from the direction of the door, followed by an unmistakable click of a deadbolt sliding into place. Evelyn's head snapped up. She ran to the door and twisted the knob. It didn't budge. She rattled it, then banged her fist against the thick metal. "Hello?" she called out, her voice swallowed by the sound, dampening walls. "Doris? Is anyone out there?" There was no answer. Just a profound, chilling silence. They were locked in. Miri came to her side, her face pale. She placed a protective hand over her pregnant belly. The room, which had felt like a treasure trove of secrets moments before, now felt like a tomb. This was no accident. The cold, calculated cruelty of it sent a wave of icy fear through Evelyn. They knew. Dobson knew she was still digging, and this was his warning. a quiet, deniable threat. You're in a place no one thinks to look for you. We can make you disappear too. For a moment, panic seized her. They were trapped. Their phones had no signal this deep in the building, and Miri's safety was paramount. All her resolve, her brave vow at her father's graveside, felt foolish and childish. She had led her pregnant daughter into a trap. But then Miri took a deep, steadying breath. "Okay," she said, her voice a little shaky but determined. "Okay. We have 20 minutes until Doris is supposed to come back. Freaking out won't help. Let's use the time." Her daughter's strength was a lifeline. Evelyn nodded, the fear solidifying back into anger. If this was a threat, then they would show their unseen tormentor that they would not be scared off. They worked with a feverish intensity, their fear fueling their search. They focused on the boxes from the summer of 1970, looking for anything related to the Black Ridge landslide. And then, at the bottom of a box filled with engineering reports, Evelyn found it. A slim, leather-bound volume simply labeled Tunnel Closure Log. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The pages were filled with handwritten entries, logging equipment, personnel, and supply deliveries for the tunnel sealing project. She flipped to the pages for mid-July, and there it was, a delivery slip dated July 17, 1970. 3 days after her father's truck supposedly sank to the bottom of the Calico River, it was a receipt for a shipment of industrial-grade sealant. At the bottom of the form, on the line for the receiving signature, was a familiar, bold scrawl she would recognize anywhere. It was her father's signature, Hank Price. He had been there. He had been alive. He had signed this logbook 3 days after the world was told he was dead. The truth hit her with the force of a physical blow. The landslide wasn't an accident that sealed an empty tunnel, it was the cover-up. And her father hadn't just been on the wrong route. He was inside it. The deadbolt on the archive room door was slid back exactly 1 hour after they'd entered. The clerk, Doris, opened it with a blank expression, a stack of mail in her hands. "Find everything you needed?" she asked, her tone flat and incurious. Evelyn's heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She wanted to scream, to accuse, to demand who had locked them in. But looking at Doris's placid face, she knew it would be useless. It was a message, delivered with the cold, untraceable efficiency of the bureaucracy that housed them. "You are being watched. We can close any door we want." Miri, ever the calm strategist, had already taken a photo of the logbook page with her phone, a tiny digital piece of defiance against their unseen jailers. They said nothing, just gathered their things with trembling hands and walked out. The image of Hank Price's signature burned into Evelyn's mind. It was a signature that proved he was alive 3 days after he was declared dead. A signature that transformed the story of a tragic accident into a story of a deliberate, calculated burial. The drive back to Evelyn's house was thick with a shared, unspoken fear. The initial, blazing triumph of their discovery was now tempered with a chilling reality. They were not just uncovering a 40-year-old secret, they were poking a sleeping monster. Back in the safety of Evelyn's kitchen, the aroma of coffee filling the air, they looked at the picture on Miri's phone. The signature was a ghost from the past, a final piece of her father reaching out across 4 decades. It was proof, yes, but it was also a dead end. He signed the form, but who gave the order? Who sent him on that unscheduled fatal route? There was only one person who would know: the dispatcher, a man named Caleb Brooks. Miri, with her meticulous research skills honed at the Historical Society, found him within an hour. He was 86 years old, retired for over 2 decades, living alone in a small clapboard house on the forgotten side of town. The decision to go see him felt heavy with risk. The memory of the locked archive door was still fresh, a stark warning against pushing further. This time, Evelyn would not be reckless. She wasn't the same woman who had naively walked into the county forum. She was learning. Before they left, Miri sent a text to her husband. "Going to 14 Willow Creek Lane. Checking in at 3 p.m. If you don't hear from us, call the state police, not local." It was a grim protocol, a quiet acknowledgement of the danger they were walking into, and it sent a cold sliver of fear down Evelyn's spine. Dobson's influence was in this town's very soil. They couldn't trust anyone. Caleb Brooks' house smelled of old wool and fading photographs. He was a frail man, swallowed by a worn armchair, his hands constantly worrying a set of dark rosary beads. His eyes, clouded with age, held a deep, watery fear. When Evelyn introduced herself, a flicker of something, recognition, terror, passed across his face before he quickly looked away. He denied everything at first. His voice was a dry, rustling whisper, claiming his memory wasn't what it used to be. He repeated the official story about the Calico River like a prayer he'd recited 1,000 times, his fingers moving faster and faster over the rosary beads. But Evelyn didn't press him. She didn't raise her voice. She simply sat opposite him, her hands folded in her lap, and spoke of her father. She told him about Hank's dry humor, the silly souvenirs he'd bring back from his trips, the way he'd let her listen to the crackle of his CB radio. She wasn't an investigator grilling a witness. She was a daughter, appealing to the last man who had sent her father off to his fate. She spoke of her own daughter, Miri, sitting beside her, and the grandchild who was on the way, a new generation that deserved to know the truth of their family's past. You could feel the walls of his denial beginning to crack, eroded by the gentle, relentless current of her grief. Finally, he broke. A single tear tracked a path through the wrinkles on his cheek. "I was told to," he whispered, the words ragged, torn from a place of ancient guilt. "I was just following orders. They told me to change his route card at the last minute, send him up to Black Ridge. They said it was a priority delivery, a state contract. I didn't know. I swear to God, I didn't know what they were planning." It was a confession, but it was hollow. The central question remained, hanging in the dusty air between them. "Who, Caleb?" Evelyn leaned forward, her voice soft but insistent. "Who told you to change the route?" He squeezed his eyes shut, his whole body trembling. "I can't. You don't understand. The man who gave the order, his family is still here. They're important people." He wouldn't name Dobson. The fear was too deep. It was a suffocating 40-year-old terror that had clearly ruled his life. Seeing he couldn't speak the name, Evelyn felt a fresh wave of outrage. The system wasn't just corrupt, it was venomous. Its poison still potent after 4 decades, still holding this old man hostage in his own home. But just as hope began to fade, Caleb shuffled over to a bookshelf and pulled down a heavy, leather-bound Bible. His hands shook so badly he could barely open the clasp. Tucked between the pages of the Old Testament was a folded, yellowed piece of paper. It was a bill of lading, the edges brittle and the text blurred from water damage. "This was his," Caleb said, pushing it into Evelyn's hand. "It fell out of his logbook when he handed it in. I kept it. I don't know why. Maybe for a day like this." It was a piece of her father, a real, tangible object from his last moments as a free man. Evelyn felt a surge of elation, a victory snatched from the jaws of fear. Here was another clue, another breadcrumb on the trail. She gripped the fragile paper, her heart soaring. "Who, Caleb?" she asked again, her voice gentle, believing this act of courage might have given him the strength to finally speak the name. "Now you have to tell me who gave the order." Caleb opened his mouth to speak. His eyes met hers, and for a second she saw a flicker of resolve. He was going to tell her, and then his face went slack. His eyes widened in a look of sudden, profound confusion. The teacup on the table beside him rattled, then fell to the floor with a sickening crash. He made a strange, gurgling sound and slumped sideways in his chair, one hand twitching, the rosary beads scattering across the floorboards. Miri was on her feet instantly, her emergency training kicking in. "Mom, call 911, he's having a stroke." The next few minutes were a blur of frantic action. Evelyn's shaky voice on the phone with the dispatcher, the wail of sirens growing closer, the paramedics rushing in. They worked over Caleb's still form as Evelyn and Miri were gently ushered out of the house, the bill of lading still clutched in Evelyn's hand. They watched as he was wheeled out on a gurney, a mask over his face, his eyes closed. Their only witness, their only link to the person who gave the order, silenced right at the moment of truth. The victory of finding the document was completely obliterated by the horror of what had just happened. Later that evening they sat at Evelyn's kitchen table, the silence heavy and funereal. The hospital had called. Caleb Brooks was alive, but he was unresponsive. The doctor said the stroke was massive, he might never speak again. The door he had been about to open was now slammed shut and locked for good. Evelyn felt a profound sense of loss, not just for the information he held, but for the tormented old man himself. They had asked him to be brave, and the effort had broken him. Miri, ever practical, laid the bill of lading on the table under a bright lamp. It was badly damaged, the ink smeared in long illegible streaks. "Maybe it's useless," Evelyn said, her voice hollow. "Just another dead end." But as she gently unfolded the brittle paper, something else fell out from its creases. It was a small, square piece of notebook paper folded tightly. It hadn't been damaged by the water. She carefully unfolded it. The handwriting was her mother's. It was a short, simple prayer, the kind she used to write and tuck into his lunchbox. "Dear Lord, watch over my Hank on the road. Keep his truck steady and his heart true. Bring him home safe to me and Evelyn." The words, written in love and hope 40 years ago, were a gut punch. He never came home. Evelyn held the tiny, fragile prayer in the palm of her hand, a testament to a faith that had gone unanswered. Her mother's hope, her father's last assignment, and a dying man's final secret, they were all here on her kitchen table. And somewhere in the smeared ink of that ruined document, she prayed, was the name of the man who had destroyed them all. Caleb Brooks's stroke felt like another door slammed in their faces, but it didn't extinguish the fire he had lit. He had confirmed the conspiracy. He had given them a piece of her father's last day. Evelyn knew they couldn't stop now. Stopping felt like a betrayal of both her father's memory and Caleb's tortured courage. The next logical step, the one that both terrified and thrilled her, was to go to the tunnel itself. They had to see it, to stand on the ground where her father was last known to be alive. But the thought of going alone, after the locked archive door and the chilling coincidence of Caleb's collapse, was unbearable. This time, they would not be caught unprepared. Miri, with her background in emergency planning, insisted on a safety protocol that felt both sensible and deeply unnerving. They would not go alone. She made a call to a friend of her husband's, a quiet, reliable man named Ben who was a volunteer safety officer for the local search and rescue team. He was told only that they were doing historical research on the landslide and needed a guide with safety expertise. It was another necessary, partial truth that left a bitter taste. Bringing Ben was a small comfort, a buffer against the unseen forces that seemed to be closing in around them. His presence, solid and competent, was a shield. The three of them drove up the winding, neglected road to Black Ridge Pass, the asphalt crumbling at the edges, slowly being reclaimed by nature. The air grew thinner, cooler. It was a place that time had forgotten. The entrance to the service tunnel was not grand. It was a simple, arched concrete opening set into the side of the mountain, sealed with a thick wall of newer, paler concrete poured decades ago. A heavy chain-link fence, topped with barbed wire, cordoned off the area with faded yellow signs that read, "Danger, Unstable Geology, No Trespassing," by order of Morgan County. But it wasn't the old, weathered warnings that made Evelyn's blood run cold. It was what was new. Gleaming on the gate was a heavy industrial-grade padlock that shone in the sun, clearly no more than a few days old. And mounted on a nearby tree, half hidden by leaves, was a small black surveillance camera, its single dark eye pointed directly at them. The message was as clear as a shout in the silent wilderness. "You were not supposed to come here. We are watching you." Dobson was one step ahead of them again. A visceral, furious anger surged through Evelyn. How dare he? How dare he treat her father's grave like his own private property to be guarded and sealed? The public humiliation, the locked door, those were warnings. This was a declaration of war. She felt a reckless, desperate urge to climb the fence, to tear down the camera with her bare hands, to scream into that unblinking lens. You could almost feel the audience's own rage boiling up, screaming, "Do it, Evelyn! Don't let him win!" Ben, however, was calm. "We're not crossing the fence," he said, his voice steady. "But there's no law against walking the perimeter." His calm professionalism was a grounding force. They walked along the fence line, the silence of the mountains broken only by the crunch of their boots on gravel. The air up here was different, charged with history and sorrow. Evelyn could almost feel her father's presence, imagining his truck rumbling to a stop right where she now stood. It was Miri who noticed the air vent. It was a small, grated opening set into the rock face, about 20 feet to the side of the sealed entrance, half overgrown with weeds. It would have been designed to allow air circulation through the tunnel. It was too small for a person, but not for a desperate hand to push something through. Evelyn knelt down, her heart pounding. The metal grate was rusted, but one of the corners had been pried up just enough to create a small gap. She peered into the darkness, the earthy smell of cold, damp stone filling her senses. And then she saw it. Wedged deep inside, just beyond her reach, was a small, black object, glinting faintly in the sliver of light that pierced the gloom. Ben produced a long multi-tool from his pocket and, with careful precision, managed to snag the object and draw it out. It was the handheld microphone for a CB radio. The coiled cord rotted and frayed, the plastic casing cracked and covered in decades of grime. But engraved on the back, in her father's familiar, neat block letters, was his radio handle, Highway Hank. A sob escaped Evelyn's throat. It was his. He had been here. He was trapped, and he had tried to call for help. He had pushed this through the vent, his last, desperate attempt to reach the outside world. She clutched it in her hands, this relic of his final moments, and felt an almost unbearable wave of grief and connection. It was the closest she had been to him in 40 years. For a moment, standing there on that desolate mountain pass, holding this piece of her father's lost voice, she felt a profound sense of hope. This was proof. Tangible, undeniable proof that he had been in that tunnel. This was more than a signature in a dusty logbook. This was a physical artifact from the scene of the crime. This, she thought, this would change everything. They drove back down the mountain in a state of adrenaline-fueled triumph, the broken microphone resting in a protective bag on Evelyn's lap. She felt a renewed sense of purpose, a certainty that justice was finally within her grasp. The camera, the padlock, they were acts of a desperate man, and desperate men make mistakes. Her elation lasted until the next afternoon. She was at the church preschool where she worked, helping a little girl glue cotton balls onto a picture of a sheep, when the pastor asked to see her in his office. Pastor Mike was a kind, gentle man who had known her for years, but the look on his face was troubled. He closed the office door, his expression pained. On his desk was an official-looking envelope from the county. "Evelyn, I got a call this morning from Supervisor Dobson's office," he began, his voice heavy. And then this was delivered by a courier. He pushed the letter across the desk. It was a cease and desist order, a legally binding document, accusing her of criminal trespass on county property at the Black Ridge site. It was filled with cold, menacing legal jargon, threatening fines and imprisonment, but it was the last paragraph that made the blood drain from her face. It stated that if she continued her harassment and unauthorized investigation, the county would be forced to review all its contracts and permits with associated community partners, including the church's lease for the preschool property. It was a threat, wrapped in the sterile language of the law. "Stop digging, or we will destroy the institution you've dedicated your life to. We will take away your job, your purpose, your community. We will hurt the children you care for." It was a vile, despicable act of cowardice, using innocent people as leverage. The joy of her discovery, the hope that she had held so tightly, shattered into a million pieces. Dobson wasn't just guarding a secret, he was willing to burn down her life to protect it. She looked at Pastor Mike, her vision blurring with tears of pure, unadulterated rage. He looked back at her, his eyes full of sympathy, but also a clear, unspoken plea. "Don't make me choose between you and this church." The feeling of betrayal was suffocating. Dobson was a pillar of this community, the man who smiled from parade floats and cut ribbons at charity events. And he was using that power to crush her, to threaten her livelihood, to make her an outcast in her own town. The broken microphone, which had felt like a key that would unlock the truth, now felt like a weapon that had been turned against her. She walked out of the office in a daze. The choice was clear and agonizing. Give up the search for her father, or risk destroying the lives of people who depended on her. Her vow at his graveside echoed in her memory, a promise she was now being forced to break. For 2 days, Evelyn lived inside a cold, gray fog of defeat. The cease and desist letter sat on her kitchen table like a venomous snake, a constant, paralyzing reminder of Clay Dobson's reach. He had found her weak spot, her loyalty, her love for her community, her job. He knew she was not a person who would willingly cause harm to others. Every time she looked at the letter, she felt the walls closing in. The vow she'd made at her father's grave now felt like a cruel joke. How could she find the truth for one person by sacrificing the well-being of so many others? The weight of the choice was crushing her. She stopped answering Miri's calls, isolating herself in a prison of her own despair. The broken CB microphone, which had been a beacon of hope, now seemed like a foolish trinket, a relic of a battle she had already lost. This was it, the end of the road. Dobson had won. It's a moment that makes you want to shake her, to shout, "Don't you dare give up now, he's just a bully in a suit." Her surrender feels like a personal betrayal to the audience who has been rooting for her, investing in her fight. But Miri, inheriting her grandfather's stubbornness, refused to let her mother surrender. She showed up at the house, not with coffee this time, but with a fierce, protective glint in her eyes that Evelyn hadn't seen before. "He is trying to scare you because he is scared of you," Miri said, her voice a low, intense hum. "This isn't about the preschool, Mom. This is about a man who is terrified of what you will find. Don't you see? His threat is proof that you're close to the truth." Miri's unwavering faith was a hand pulling Evelyn from the mire, but it was what Miri held in her own hand that truly changed everything. She had found a man, an old ham radio hobbyist named Arthur who lived on the outskirts of town, a man who collected and restored vintage electronics. He had agreed to look at the CB microphone. Arthur's workshop was a cluttered, magical cave filled with the skeletons of old radios and televisions, the air smelling of solder and ozone. He was a man with kind eyes and hands as delicate as a surgeon's. He took the battered microphone with a reverence that touched Evelyn's heart. He worked for hours, meticulously cleaning the contacts, resoldering brittle wires, his face illuminated by the glow of a magnifying lamp. Finally, he connected it to an old base unit, a nest of wires and glowing vacuum tubes. He flipped a switch. A low hiss filled the room. Arthur turned a dial, and the hiss crackled into static. And then, a click. A voice, faint and distorted by 40 years of silence and decay, filled the small workshop. "Breaker 1-9, this is Highway Hank. Is anyone out there?" Evelyn's breath hitched. She stumbled forward, gripping the edge of the workbench, her knuckles white. It was him. It was her father's voice. A ghost captured in magnetic tape. "They're bringing in the cement trucks. They're sealing it tonight. My rig is inside. They've got me trapped." There was a pause, filled with the heavy sound of his breathing. When he spoke again, his voice was thick with an emotion that tore through Evelyn's soul. "If anyone hears this, get a message to my family. Tell my Evelyn, tell my little girl I'm proud of her. Tell her I love her." The recording clicked off, leaving behind a silence more profound and devastating than any sound. Tears streamed down Evelyn's face, hot and unstoppable. 40 years. For 40 years, she had carried the ache of his absence, the unanswered questions, the unresolved goodbyes. And now, in this dusty room, she had heard his last words. He hadn't been thinking of his own fate. He had been thinking of her. It was not a message of despair, but a message of love, a final, desperate act of a father reaching out to his child. The despair that had held her captive for days was burned away by a clean, white-hot fury. This wasn't just a story about a missing trucker anymore. This was about a man murdered by cowards, silenced and buried alive, his final loving words to his daughter left to rot in a hole in the ground. Her fight was no longer just for the truth. It was for him. It was for justice. The emotional high of hearing his voice, of finally having that connection, was the most profound peak of hope she had experienced. It was proof he was alive during the sealing, proof that he fought, that he was thinking of her. This was the smoking gun. Dobson couldn't dismiss this. But as Arthur switched off the machine, his face was grim. "There's something else you need to know," he said, his voice soft. "When you brought this to me, I recognized the inventory tag on the back. It's faint, but it's there." He pointed to a small stamped code on the casing. "That's the evidence tag from the Morgan County Sheriff's Office." Evelyn stared at him, uncomprehending. "What are you talking about?" Arthur took a deep breath. "A friend of mine was the evidence clerk back in the 70s. After the official search for your father was called off, a hiker found this microphone near the ridge a few months later, in early 1971. He turned it in. It was logged as evidence, item number 407B. It was insignificant debris. Officially, the implication landed like a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. The sheriff's office had this microphone in 1971. They had her father's last message. They knew he was in that tunnel. They knew it wasn't an accident. They knew, and they did nothing. They buried it. The cover-up wasn't just a matter of falsified paperwork 40 years ago. It was an active, ongoing conspiracy. They had hidden his last words, his last plea, his last message of love, and left her to grieve a lie for her entire adult life. Her victory, her moment of pure, transcendent connection with her father, was instantly poisoned. The rage she felt was a physical thing, so intense it made her dizzy. They hadn't just let him die, they had erased him, they had stolen his voice. Just as this new, terrible reality was sinking in, Miri's phone buzzed with a news alert from the local paper. Her face went ashen as she read it aloud. "The Morgan County Board of Supervisors has just approved an emergency measure to demolish the Black Ridge Service Tunnel entrance, citing immediate and severe public safety risks due to geological instability. Fencing is being erected, and demolition is scheduled to begin within 72 hours. It was a breathtakingly fast and brazen move. He knew. Dobson must have known they had the microphone, or he suspected they were about to find something that could expose him. He wasn't just guarding the tunnel anymore, he was going to destroy it. He was going to pulverize the evidence, erase her father's tomb from the face of the earth, and with it, any hope of ever learning the full truth. The clock was ticking. The faint, ghostly voice on the radio, which had just given her father back to her, was about to be silenced again, this time forever, under tons of rubble and concrete. Her despair was gone, replaced by a cold, hard certainty. There would be no more quiet investigation, no more playing by the rules of a game that was rigged against her. This was a race against time, and she was done being the victim. With the county's demolition crews preparing to erase her father's tomb from the map, Evelyn's grief and fury crystallized into a desperate, reckless plan. The quiet, methodical school secretary was gone, replaced by a warrior fighting a war against the clock. She would no longer be silenced. She would no longer play their dirty game by their clean rules. If Clay Dobson wanted a public fight, she would give him one he would never forget. With Miri's help, she called every local news station, every regional newspaper, and every blogger who had ever written a skeptical word about the Morgan County administration. She announced a press conference to be held the next morning on the steps of the county courthouse. Her one condition: she wanted a sound system powerful enough to play a 40-year-old audio recording for the whole town to hear. This was a breathtakingly bold move, a decision born of sheer desperation. You find yourself holding your breath, knowing this is the point of no return. She is putting everything on the line, betting it all on one public gamble. Standing before a bank of microphones the next day, Evelyn's hands trembled, but her voice was as clear and steady as a bell. She was no longer the humiliated, flustered woman who had begged for help at the supervisor's forum. She was a daughter armed with the truth. She told the story of the key, the logbook, the locked archive room, and the threats against her job. The crowd of reporters murmured, their pens scratching furiously. Then, she held up the grimy CB microphone. "Supervisor Dobson would have you believe this is just a piece of trash," she said, her voice ringing with conviction. "He would have you believe his demolition order is about public safety, but the truth is, he is trying to destroy evidence." She gave a nod to Miri, who stood by a small sound system. Miri pressed play, and then, her father's voice, ghostly, crackling, but unmistakably clear, filled the courthouse square. "Breaker 19, this is Highway Hank. They're sealing it tonight. Tell my Evelyn. Tell my little girl I'm proud of her." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. The reporters stood stunned. their cameras fixed on Evelyn's tear-streaked face. For the first time, her fight was not just her own. The story of Hank Price, the missing trucker, was suddenly the story of a county-wide cover-up. Phones began ringing in the county offices. Old-timers who remembered her father started gathering at the edges of the crowd, their faces etched with a mixture of shock and dawning anger. The tide was turning. Evelyn felt a surge of triumphant, righteous power. The truth, her father's own words, had finally broken free. Later that day, her gamble paid off. Faced with a brewing public relations nightmare, a judge granted an emergency one-day injunction, halting the demolition pending a hearing. It was a small victory, but it was everything. They had bought themselves 24 hours. For that one afternoon, Evelyn allowed herself to feel hope. The community was rallying around her. People who had been afraid to speak up were now calling her, offering stories, support, and prayers. She and Mary sat at the kitchen table, not in fear, but in a state of exhausted elation, the sounds of supportive calls buzzing on her phone. But Dobson was not a man to be cornered easily. He was a creature of quiet influence and backroom power, and he was at his most dangerous when threatened. That evening, he appeared on the local news, his face a perfect mask of concerned authority. He didn't look angry. He looked sad. He spoke of Evelyn with a tone of deep, sorrowful pity, calling her a distraught daughter manipulated by fringe conspiracy theorists. He painted her as unstable, her so-called evidence as a cruel hoax. He talked about the sacred duty of the county to protect its citizens from the very real danger of the unstable Black Ridge Tunnel. "This is not a cover-up," he said, looking directly into the camera, his hand rubbing that telltale wedding ring. "This is a heartbreaking publicity stunt, and it is endangering us all." It was a masterful performance of gaslighting and manipulation, designed to poison the well of public opinion, to turn her newfound allies against her. The supportive calls slowed to a trickle. Doubt began to creep back into the town's consciousness. Evelyn felt a cold knot of dread form in her stomach. He was twisting her truth into a lie, using his power to reshape reality itself. The night before the hearing, Evelyn had to drive a rural mountain road to meet with her pro bono lawyer, a young, idealistic man who had been inspired by her press conference. The road was dark, winding, and slick with evening mist. Mary, ever cautious, had made her promise to call the moment she arrived. As she came around a sharp hairpin turn, a deer leaped into the road. Evelyn slammed on the brakes. The pedal went straight to the floor. Nothing. There was a sickening, spongy feeling of complete failure. The car didn't slow. It surged forward, careening towards the steep, rocky drop-off on the other side of the road. Panic, cold and absolute, seized her. Time seemed to stretch and warp. In a split second of adrenaline-fueled clarity, she wrenched the wheel hard, pulling the car into a desperate skid, aiming for the rocky embankment on the inside of the turn rather than the open air of the cliff edge. The car slammed into the rock wall with a deafening shriek of tearing metal. The airbag exploded, knocking the wind out of her. The world went dark, filled with the smell of burnt rubber and the tinkle of broken glass. When she came to, sirens were screaming in the distance. Mary, her voice tight with panic, was already on the phone. She'd called for help the moment Evelyn was a minute late checking in. Her daughter's safety protocols had just saved her life. The tow truck driver later confirmed her fears. The brake line hadn't failed. It had been cut. Neatly, professionally. She sat in the back of a police car, wrapped in a scratchy blanket, the adrenaline giving way to a bone-deep, trembling terror. This was a message. Not a threat in a letter, not a locked door, but a direct, violent attempt on her life. Dobson wasn't just trying to silence her anymore. He was trying to eliminate her. The terror was so overwhelming, so absolute, that it almost extinguished her will to fight. What was she doing? She was a school secretary, not a crusader. She had a daughter, a grandchild on the way. The price of this truth might be her life. She was on the verge of giving up, of telling the lawyer to drop the injunction, of walking away from it all just to keep her family safe. Then, sitting in the cold silence of the police car, she remembered the water-damaged bill of lading she had tucked into her purse for the lawyer. Her fingers, still shaking, found it. Inside she felt the small, folded note from her mother. She pulled it out and read the simple prayer again under the dome light. Keep his truck steady and his heart true. Bring him home safe to me and Evelyn. In that moment, the words weren't about her father anymore. They were about her. She was on a dangerous road. She was fighting for what was true. Her mother's faith, her father's love, their legacy of courage, it all flowed into her, a current of strength pushing back against the tide of fear. He had tried to kill her, and he had failed. He had underestimated the daughter of Highway Hank. As the sun rose the next morning, Evelyn walked towards the courthouse, bruised and sore, but with a resolve harder than steel. She wasn't just fighting for a memory anymore. She was fighting for her life, and she would not lose. The judge, a no-nonsense woman with tired eyes who had seen her share of county politics, listened intently in the packed courtroom. On one side stood Evelyn, her face bruised from the accident, a silent testament to the violence simmering beneath the surface of this case. On the other side stood Clay Dobson, his tailored suit immaculate, his expression a careful blend of civic concern and weary exasperation. When Evelyn's lawyer presented the police report detailing the severed brake line, a shocked murmur went through the room. Dobson's mask of composure flickered for just a second. The judge, seeing the blatant act of intimidation for what it was, extended the injunction. But she went a step further. She ordered the county to unseal the entrance to the Black Ridge Tunnel, not for a full-scale excavation, but for a preliminary structural assessment to be overseen by an independent engineer and observed by Evelyn and her counsel. The victory was stunning, absolute. It was more than Evelyn had dared to hope for. Dobson had overplayed his hand. His violent attempt to silence her had backfired spectacularly, pushing a skeptical judge firmly into Evelyn's corner. As they left the courthouse, a small crowd of supporters erupted in applause. The tide had not just turned, it was becoming a flood. For the first time since this ordeal began, Evelyn felt the solid ground of public support beneath her feet. She was no longer a lone voice crying in the wilderness. She was the leader of a town that was waking up to a 40-year-old lie. The day they unsealed the tunnel was heavy with a strange mixture of hope and dread. The air was crisp and cold, the mountains silent except for the low groan of heavy machinery. A team of volunteer firefighters, their presence, a quiet act of defiance against the county's authority, stood by to ensure safety protocols were followed. Miri was there, a portable scanner in hand, her face a mask of determined calm. Evelyn stood a little apart, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She was about to step into her father's tomb. She was about to come face to face with the answer she had sought for her entire life. Dobson was there too, forced to attend by the court order, his face a thunderous mask of rage. He stood with a team of county lawyers, whispering furiously, his very presence a toxic cloud over the proceedings. The process was painstakingly slow. Engineers drilled test holes, checking for gas pockets and structural weakness. Finally, after hours of methodical work, a section of the concrete wall was cut away, large enough for a person to step through. A wave of cool, musty air, untouched for 40 years, washed over them. It smelled of damp earth, diesel, and something else, the faint, metallic scent of time itself. An engineer with a powerful flashlight was the first to step inside, his voice echoing eerily from the darkness. "It's stable," he called out. "And there's a truck in here." Those words, simple and direct, struck Evelyn with the force of a physical blow. She stumbled forward, her hand flying to her mouth. It was real. After all the lies, all the denials, all the threats, it was real. He was here. With the firefighters flanking her for safety, Evelyn stepped across the threshold, from the bright mountain sunlight into the cold, silent dark. The beam of her flashlight cut through the blackness, landing on the familiar shape of a 1960s semi-truck. It was covered in a thick, gray blanket of dust, but the logo on the door was still faintly visible. Morgan County Freight. It was his. She had found him. Tears blurred her vision as she slowly approached the driver's side door. It was slightly ajar, as if he had just stepped out for a moment. She reached out a trembling hand and pulled it open. The interior was perfectly preserved, a time capsule from a summer day in 1970. A half-empty coffee cup sat in a holder. A folded newspaper lay on the passenger seat. On the dashboard, Propped against the speedometer was a small plush toy dog, its button eyes staring out into the darkness. It was the good luck charm she had given him on his last birthday. She collapsed against the side of the truck, the grief she had held at bay for 40 years finally breaking free in a storm of ragged, heartbroken sobs. She had found his truck, she had found his last moments, but the cab was empty. There were no human remains, just the heartbreakingly ordinary artifacts of a life cut short. He wasn't in the truck. A frantic, desperate hope ignited in the midst of her sorrow. If he wasn't in the truck, maybe he got out. Maybe he survived. But as the engineers and firefighters began a more thorough search of the immediate area, the scene revealed a new, baffling mystery. The dust on the tunnel floor was thick and undisturbed, like a layer of gray snow. In it were 2 sets of footprints. One set, made by heavy work boots, led from the driver's side of the truck. Her father's footprints. They walked a short distance into the tunnel and then they were joined by a second set. These were smaller, made by different shoes. Someone else had been in the tunnel with him. The 2 sets of prints then walked together, side by side, for another 50 feet, deeper into the mountain's darkness, before they stopped at the base of a small, metal maintenance ladder leading up to a ventilation shaft in the ceiling. And that's where the trail ended. The footprints led to the ladder and vanished. There was no sign of a struggle, no scuff marks, no blood. Just 2 people who had walked to a ladder and disappeared into the mountain. The hope that had flared within her moments before was extinguished, replaced by a profound and chilling confusion. What did this mean? Who was with him? Was it a friend or a foe? Did they escape together? Or was this the site of his murder, his body hidden somewhere in the labyrinth of shafts above? As she stared at the footprints, trying to make sense of the impossible, Dobson strode forward, his voice booming with false authority. "This is a crime scene," he declared, though he had spent weeks denying anything was there. "A highly unstable one. I am ordering this tunnel be cleared and resealed immediately, pending a full investigation by my office. The collapse danger is extreme." It was a brazen, desperate attempt to regain control, to bury the evidence he had been forced to reveal. He was trying to shut the door on her again, right when she was on the verge of a new discovery. The firefighters stood their ground, refusing to leave without a direct order from the judge. The scene became a tense standoff, a battle of wills at the mouth of the dark, silent tunnel. Evelyn felt herself plummeting from the emotional high of finding the truck into the lowest point of despair she had yet known. She was so close. The answer was right there, in those ghostly footprints in the dust. But a wall of lies and power was rising to block her path once more. She had opened her father's tomb, only to find it held not a body, but a riddle that was more mystifying and more terrifying than the simple, brutal truth she had expected to find. The standoff at the tunnel entrance was a cold war fought with glares and muttered legal threats. Clay Dobson, accustomed to a world where his word was law, was visibly enraged by the defiance of the volunteer firefighters and the steely gaze of Evelyn's lawyer. He was losing control, and the desperation was making him sloppy. But just as the argument reached a fever pitch, a state trooper's cruiser came up the mountain road, its lights flashing silently. A uniformed officer stepped out, holding a phone. Mary's phone had been buzzing for the last 10 minutes with a call from the hospital. Caleb Brooks, the dispatcher, had stirred. He had regained consciousness just for a moment. He couldn't speak, but he could move his right hand. A quick-thinking nurse had given him a pen and a clipboard, and with a shaky, almost illegible scrawl, he had written a single name. And then he sent a note to Mary, passed to her through a friendly nurse who had been following the case in the local paper. The trooper showed the message on his phone to Evelyn's lawyer. The name on the note wasn't Clay Dobson. It was his father, Franklin Dobson, the former county supervisor, a man long dead and revered as a town patriarch. The note also contained 2 words: quarry shaft. Suddenly the puzzle pieces began to slam into place with breathtaking, horrifying clarity. It was never just about one tunnel. It was about a network. The footprints in the dust, the maintenance shaft, they were an exit. The real bombshell came in the form of a second call, this one from a federal marshal's office. Caleb's scribbled note had triggered an old, sealed federal file. With Franklin Dobson deceased, The primary target of the original investigation was gone, and a clerk had been instructed to notify the family if new evidence ever came to light. The voice on the other end of the line was calm, professional, and it methodically dismantled 40 years of lies. Franklin Dobson had been the mastermind of a massive, illegal smuggling ring, using county resources and a network of forgotten service tunnels, including the one at Black Ridge, to move untaxed goods and other illicit cargo across state lines. It was a secret empire built right under the noses of the town he pretended to serve. Hank Price, a reliable driver known for his punctuality and his habit of sticking to the rules, had stumbled upon the operation by accident. He saw something he wasn't supposed to see, a discrepancy in a manifest, a route that didn't make sense. He had a choice: become a part of their criminal enterprise or be silenced. Hank, a Korean War veteran with a rigid sense of duty, chose neither. He chose to be a witness. What happened next wasn't a murder, but a botched kidnapping. They forced him to drive his rig into the tunnel, planning to scare him, to make him disappear for a few days until the heat was off. But they underestimated Hank Price. He wasn't a man who scared easily. The second set of footprints belonged to a federal agent who had been deep undercover in Dobson's operation. Together, while the cement truck sealed the entrance, Hank and the agent had escaped up through the maintenance shaft, which connected to an old abandoned quarry on the other side of the ridge. Hank Price had never been a victim. He had been a hero. He had entered the Witness Protection Program, his testimony instrumental in dismantling a significant part of Dobson's network in other counties. He was given a new name, a new life, and was forbidden from ever contacting his family again for their own protection. The silence he endured for 40 years wasn't the silence of the grave. It was the silence of a soldier on a secret, lifelong mission to protect his family from the very people who had stolen his life from him. The news was a seismic shock, a complete upending of the reality Evelyn had constructed. Her father wasn't dead. He had been alive all these years. He hadn't been murdered. He had escaped. The wave of relief was so powerful, it almost brought her to her knees. He was alive, but it was immediately followed by a crushing, heartbreaking sorrow. He was alive, and she never knew. He had lived out his days somewhere else, as someone else, while she grieved a ghost. Their lives had run on parallel tracks, separated by a wall of secrets she had never even known existed. The federal agent on the phone delivered the final, devastating blow with quiet sympathy. Hank Price, living under his protected alias, had died of natural causes 5 years ago. He had passed away peacefully in a small town 3 states over. She had found him, but it was too late. The reunion she had subconsciously yearned for could now never happen. As this new, bittersweet reality settled over her, a cold, clarifying anger took its place. Franklin Dobson was dead, beyond the reach of justice, but his son was standing right in front of her. Clay Dobson hadn't been part of the original smuggling ring. He was too young. But he knew. He had spent his entire adult life protecting his father's legacy, obstructing justice, intimidating witnesses, and even attempting to murder a woman just to keep this rotten family secret buried. Evelyn walked slowly toward him, the crowd parting before her. The federal agent's call had been on speaker, and everyone, the firefighters, the lawyers, the state trooper, had heard the truth. Clay's face was ashen, his polished composure completely gone, leaving only the raw, ugly fear of a cornered rat. He saw her coming, and his hand went to his wedding ring, his thumb rubbing it furiously, the nervous tick of a lifelong liar. She stopped directly in front of him, the whole world seeming to fade away until it was just the two of them, the mountain air thick with 40 years of deceit. "My father was a hero," she said, her voice low and shaking with a controlled rage. "He gave up everything, his home, his name, his family, to do what was right. And you tried to kill his daughter to protect a smuggler and a coward. Your father's legacy isn't honor, it's shame, and now it's yours." She didn't shout. She didn't have to. The quiet power of her words, delivered with the full weight of her 40-year ordeal, was more damning than any accusation. The state trooper stepped forward, his hand resting on his service weapon. "Clay Dobson," he said, his voice ringing with authority in the mountain quiet, "you are under arrest for obstruction of justice, witness tampering, and attempted murder." As the handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists, Clay Dobson finally looked away from Evelyn, his eyes empty. The dynasty his father had built on a foundation of secrets and crime had crumbled to dust at the feet of a quiet school secretary who simply refused to stop asking questions. Justice, it turned out, had not been buried in the tunnel, it had just been waiting. The arrest of Clay Dobson sent a shockwave through Morgan County, shattering the placid surface of the town and exposing the rot that had festered beneath it for generations. The news reports were relentless, each one uncovering another layer of the Dobson family's deceit. But for Evelyn, the public spectacle of justice was a distant noise. She was adrift in a quiet, lonely sea of complicated grief. The world celebrated a mystery solved, a villain brought to justice. But she mourned a life she never got to know, a father who had been a living ghost. The immense relief of knowing he hadn't been murdered in that cold, dark tunnel was inextricably tangled with the profound sorrow of a reunion that would never be. He hadn't died in 1970. But he was still gone. A week after Dobson's arrest, a package arrived, delivered by a quiet man in a plain suit who introduced himself as a representative of a federal legal trust. The box was small and unassuming. Inside, cushioned on a bed of tissue paper, were the last remnants of her father's 2 lives. There was a worn leather wallet containing the driver's license of a man named David Miller, the alias he had lived under for 35 years. Staring up at her from the plastic was her father's face, older, lined with the years she had missed. But his eyes were the same, kind and steady. Tucked behind the license was a single, faded photograph, creased from decades of being held. It was a picture of her, aged 7, sitting on the steps of their old house, smiling a gap-toothed smile. He had carried her with him, a secret, sacred memory in a life he could never share. Beneath the wallet was a sealed envelope. Her name, Evelyn, was written on the front in his familiar, bold script. Her hands trembled so much she could barely tear it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a letter written in a hand made frail by age. It wasn't a confession or an explanation of the conspiracy. He knew the federal agents would handle that. It was just a letter from a father to the daughter he was never allowed to see again. He wrote that not a day had passed when he didn't think of her, that his proudest memories were of her childhood, and that his greatest act of love had been to walk away, to keep her safe from the evil that had infested their town. He ended the letter with a simple, handwritten prayer, an echo of the one her mother had written for him so many years ago. "Dear Lord, watch over my Evelyn on her road. Keep her truck steady and her heart true. Bring her peace, and let her know her father's love was always with her." Reading those words, the 40 years of silence, of questions, of aching loss, finally found a resolution. It wasn't the ending she had ever imagined, but it was an ending nonetheless. The love was real. The sacrifice was real. His silence had not been abandonment. It had been his ultimate act of protection. The final item in the box was a small velvet bag. Inside was a key, a heavy, worn brass trucker's key, identical to the one that had started her on this journey. The one that a repentant, dying federal agent had anonymously mailed to her, hoping to finally set the truth in motion. Her father had kept his, a key to a truck and a life he could never return to, a silent symbol of all he had lost. Weeks later, after the media frenzy had died down and Clay Dobson was awaiting trial, the county officially released her father's truck to her. It was cleaned and polished, a gleaming relic pulled from the past. Evelyn organized a memorial service, not at the cemetery where his empty grave had stood for so long, but at the mouth of the Black Ridge Tunnel. The whole town, it seemed, turned out. They came to honor the man they now knew as a hero and to apologize, in their own quiet way, for the decades they had believed a convenient lie. Miri stood beside her, holding her own newborn daughter, a tiny new life in a story that had been so consumed by death. Evelyn didn't speak of conspiracies or corruption. She spoke of her father, the man who loved diner coffee and bad jokes, the man who had taught her how to stand up for what was right, no matter the cost. She read his final letter aloud, his words of love and sacrifice echoing in the mountain air. She had found the truth. She had cleared his name. Justice, in its own messy and imperfect way, had been served. But the cost was immense. She had uncovered the story of his life, but she had lost the chance to be a part of it. Their final conversation would forever be that ghostly, crackling voice on a CB radio, a message of love from a concrete tomb. The victory was real, but the scars would remain. After the crowd had dispersed and a gentle quiet fell over the mountain once more, Evelyn walked over to the old truck. The cab door creaked open, smelling faintly of dust and time. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the small, plush toy dog she had found on the dashboard. Its button eyes seemed to hold the wisdom of the intervening 40 years. She placed it back in its spot, propped against the speedometer, a silent guardian for a journey that was finally over. Leaning her head against the cool glass of the window, she whispered the words of the vow she had made so long ago at his empty grave. "I found you, Dad." She had fulfilled her promise. The mystery was solved. The hole in her life, the one that had been carved out in the summer of 1970, was not filled, but its edges were no longer sharp and jagged. They had been softened by the bittersweet truth. She had lost her father twice, once to a lie and once to the truth. But in finding him, she had also found a strength in herself she never knew she possessed. And she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her soul, that her father would be proud.